Hi, this is Kirk, the Bariatric Carnivore. Now, one of the things I keep harping on all the time is really, frankly, the only person who can look after your health is you. And many people would say, well, that's not completely true. You can trust your government. And I'm going to try to explain to you why you really shouldn't trust even your government for health advice. Because they've been manipulating us for a very long time. And let me give you one of my favorite examples. And before you think that this is a right-wing conspiracy type thing, this is the actual guts of the story I got from an NPR website. So NPR, if it's any conspiracy, it would be a left-wing conspiracy from NPR. Though I have found this on sites on both conservative and liberal sides, so I trust the veracity of the history of this. And basically what the story comes down to is this. Back in 1966, the price of eggs was skyrocketing. I mean, the prices were almost doubling. So we saw some of that in the last year or so, when the price of eggs goes from almost $1 a dozen to $5 a dozen almost overnight. Well, the same type of effect was happening in 1966. And the reason why it was happening back then was because Lyndon Johnson was expanding the money supply rather dramatically. There were two things that were going on. One was the military-industrial complex was spending a lot of money escalating the war in Vietnam. So there's a lot of money being spent over there from the federal side. And Lyndon Johnson began the Great Society, which was the first major welfare program. So there's a lot of money being spent. So they're printing more money, and that's causing the prices of things to go up that are not fixed. So for instance, you could slow down the rate of inflation for cars because you could increase production. But with certain commodities, particularly agricultural commodities, those were fixed productions. And what I mean by that is ever since the Great Depression, the way the federal government controlled agricultural prices to make sure farmers received a fair wage was they controlled production. So they created limits to how much land you could farm and how many cows you could raise and stuff like that to keep the prices high. And that way the farmers would get enough money for their prices. What happened during the Great Depression was there's so much production, and a bunker wheat crop comes in and prices collapsed. And right at that particular moment when everything else was collapsing, everybody got much poorer. And soon there was nobody there to make food. So that becomes a horrible cycle. And to prevent that from happening, the government would limit production to a set amount, and that would keep prices relatively stable and farmers could get paid. Well, they could not increase production of eggs to lower the cost. So what Johnson did was he told his Surgeon General, and his Surgeon General at that time had a tremendous amount of credibility. The reason for that is because a little bit earlier, he had put out the first Surgeon General's warning that smoking caused cancer. And it was a powerful message. It was the first time where the government had really come out and said the legal product was inherently dangerous. And at that time, nearly half of all adults smoked. And half of the people who smoked quit almost immediately after the Surgeon General's report. So the Surgeon General had a tremendous amount of credibility with a vast swath of the American public. And Johnson decided to tap into that credibility and have him issue a report saying that eggs were dangerous to your health, that they were killers. There was no studies involved. He didn't do any research on it. They just issued a press release on it. And as a result, this began our war on eggs. Every now and then you see a report that says eggs are going to kill you. Then a few months later, another report comes out and says, well, eggs aren't that bad. And then they come out with another report that said eggs are going to kill you. You see the cycle. Well, the cycle began in 1966 because Lyndon Johnson wanted to lower the price of eggs by lowering the demand, by having a Surgeon General lie that eggs were somehow dangerous for your health. And as a result, egg prices dropped because demand dropped. And it started a major change in America's diet. You may remember, if you're a boomer like I am, I remember that there were some changes that were happening in the American diet. We quit drinking stuff like orange juice and started drinking Tang, and they started switching from eggs to Carnation instant breakfast and stuff like that. Sugary stuff that was supposed to be healthy. And it was supposed to be the modern way of eating, but actually it was just a cheaper way of eating, and it didn't show up in the inflation. People were kind of used to paying so much for Tang or so much for the instant breakfast, and nobody noticed that there was inflation going on. They were switching from eggs to Carnation instant breakfast and Tang. So, it wasn't doing much for our health, but it made life easier for the politicians. Let's move forward a few years. Lyndon Johnson quits. Nixon becomes president. Nixon, because of some way things were working, took us off the gold standard and created what is called fiat currency. Fiat means by decree. So the government decreed, this is $1, this is how much it's worth, and we have to take it. It was no longer backed up by gold. Our gold reserve was held at Fort Knox. That used to be what, we only could print enough money that was equal to the amount of gold at Fort Knox. Lyndon Johnson was expanding that, making the dollar worth less, creating inflation. Well, Nixon takes us off the gold standard, which begins a new process that nobody had ever really seen before called hyperinflation, or at least they hadn't seen it since the Germans prior to World War II. And we knew what could happen with hyperinflation. And one of the things that Nixon was concerned about was that, oh my gosh, every time there's periods of hyperinflation, price of food goes up dramatically, and when the price of food goes up dramatically, people revolt. Historically, that has happened. That still happens today. There was a revolution over in Sri Lanka recently where, the government there, they didn't cut down food. They actually just wouldn't allow them to use enough fertilizer to be able to grow crops adequately in that sandy soil, and as a result food production dropped, prices skyrocketed, people are starving. They overthrew a government over that, and Nixon was very concerned about the same thing happening in the United States, and he's starting to see the price of commodities going up. So he tells his Secretary of Agriculture, Butz, to get rid of the limited amount of it and increased production. And we started, we took off all the limits of production on some major commodities, 5 in particular, but we also started subsidizing them too. Those commodities are really fascinating. Pay attention to this list. They are corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. The reason why these are so important is because these became highly subsidized products that we are now developing huge surpluses for. So Butz's position was, okay, if we've got surpluses, let's start selling it overseas as quickly as possible. Let's not create deflation, but let's, make this thing profitable. So we started selling corn and wheat that we'd grown in the United States and the taxpayers had helped subsidize. We started selling that to the communists. We started selling it to Russia because they were having another communist wheat famine. And then we started selling our rice over to China. Well, as things happened, production started happening better in those other countries. They didn't, the communists really didn't want to become dependent on the United States for their food. So they kind of stopped after the emergency was over. Now we have this big surplus of these crops. And the prices of major commodities starts to drop. And now Big Food is trying to figure out what are they going to be able to do with these extra subsidies. And remember what they are. They are corn. Somebody looks at corn and goes, you know what? We're not subsidizing sugar prices. Why don't we turn corn into high fructose corn syrup? And then in the 70s, they started switching the formulations of major soft drinks from sugar to high fructose corn syrup, which, by the way, creates very fatty livers and it makes it even easier to get type 2 diabetes than just drinking regular sugar. And it kept on getting worse. All these highly subsidized products created a revolution. And at the same time, you've got McGovern pushing this idea that we need to eat a plant-based, low-fat diet, that high-fat diets were going to clog our arteries, even though we've been eating them for millions of years. But suddenly, because we're modern, this is going to start killing us. And it changed the food industry. And all the highly processed foods, the stuff that you find in the middle of the supermarket, are basically all built on these 5 major ingredients: corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. And you may be thinking, how does cotton happen? Cotton happens because it creates Crisco, vegetable oils. All these things can be converted into various hyper-palatable, quote-unquote, foods. So a Dorito is all subsidized, very cheap ingredients. Pringles, the same 9 yards. If you look at it, everything that they're offering you is going to be built on these 5 ingredients. And they're going to call them food, and the price of those things are very, very inexpensive because they're highly subsidized with your tax dollars, and that keeps the cost of these type of nutrients, these type of calories, basically, at very low cost. And that is why your government this week or this month, sometime this year, is agreeing with Tufts University School of Nutrition that Fruit Loops, which are basically corn and wheat with corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup and all this other stuff, that is much more nutritious than an egg cooked in butter. Because guess what? The egg cooked in butter ain't subsidized. They're basically pushing the cheap crap, human pet chow, down your throats because they're subsidizing this other stuff. And if you guys don't eat it, we're going to have an overabundance, even more of an oversupply of food that nobody wants. Because frankly, it's not really food. When you look at it, when you break this stuff down, corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice are some of the least nutritious foods out there. I mean, they do not even come close to the amount of nutrients you get from beef. And this is the advice. When you look at the food pyramid, think about what our government is subsidizing that's the cheapest. They're trying to feed you at the cheapest, keep you fed, keep you happy. But what's the end result? The end result is an explosion in type 2 diabetes, obesity, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But unfortunately, we don't see the link between the crap diet that our government is pushing on us and all these bad health outcomes. And frankly, it gets a little bit worse because now the government's in bed with big health. The big medical centers are making a fortune off the crappy diet that has been forced on everybody through the government and their subsidies. It costs money. It costs extra cash out of your pocket to break yourself away from this processed food monopoly that we've got and get away from the government subsidies. And if we got rid of the government subsidies and that food cost what it's supposed to cost, if it was truly at market forces, it would mushroom astronomically. I mean, go walking down the regular processed food aisle. Take a look at a can of Chef Boyardee spaghetti and meatballs. Realize that this is highly subsidized. What it really costs is almost twice as much as what they're charging for it, because your tax dollars are subsidizing most of the key ingredients in it. Most of the calories are subsidized by your tax dollars. That's what feeds the majority of Americans. When you look at over 80% of America's calories are coming from these ultra-processed foods that are basically from your tax dollars subsidizing them, keeping the prices artificially low. Big Food is there, making it hyper palatable as possible to get you to be able to eat it and continue to eat it by adding more sugar and salts and other stuff that just make it to where everything just tastes absolutely delectable and getting you addicted to it. It is a horrible system designed basically to kill you, but not to kill you overnight, but to kill you slowly over time. I mean, there's no money in, if big food killed you overnight, big medicine wouldn't make any money. They just prefer you kind of sick and sloppy. And this is what I mean when I say that the system is psychopathic. It's not designed with your health in mind. You have to break free, and the only person that can do that is you. You're all alone in this. If you don't do it, the government ain't going to do it. They're going to be subsidizing cheap food and keep throwing it at you as long as you keep eating it. The only way to break free is to make that decision that I'm going to break free. You're all alone in this, but you're all alone in this together. There's a community, and it's growing. It is a real, genuine grassroots movement, but it's not nearly big enough to end this mess. So frankly, don't expect a savior to rise from anywhere. I don't care if it's Trump, Biden, or Kennedy. None of these guys are going to save you from this vast empire that is big pharma, big food, big media, big government. All these guys, they're all working against you and your health. Frankly, you are alone in this, and the only way to get out of it is to learn as much as you possibly can and start to figure this stuff out. This is Kirk, the Bariatric Carnivore. If you like this message, please hit the like and subscribe button. I try to put out a message a couple of times a week. I'm looking forward to the next couple. They're fun, and hopefully, you can share. Try to like, subscribe, get other people to join in this community, because the more people we have that are working to regain their own health, the healthier this country is going to be. But don't expect any saviors. Like Bruce Springsteen said, don't expect a savior to rise from these streets. It's going to somehow lead people to healthier living. The only way you're going to get healthy is you deciding you're going to get healthy. It's up to you. Hopefully, you're going to grab it and start making a difference. I will talk to you soon.